All right, so we are resuming with the Chinese fairy tale of Lady Whitesnake. Part 7. Presently came the 5th day of the 5th month. This was the day of each year when the gods had commanded that all magic beings in human form should turn back into their true shapes, so that everyone could know them for what they truly were. So on this day, the priests all over the country would make special food and a special orange-colored drink, and burn a bright red incense. Everyone was supposed to eat the food and drink the orange-colored drink and smell the incense, because this would make the changelings reveal themselves. White Modest Beauty and Green Eyes, who was living with them, were very afraid that in this way they might be revealed as serpents. So they decided that all day long they would not eat or drink a single thing, but they could not help smelling the incense, and its power was so strong that at last White Modest Beauty fell back in her chair half fainting. Her head was singing, and she saw again above her the green grass and the trees that seemed to reach to heaven itself, and at the same time there was a curtain like thick velvet before her eyes, and it felt as though a band of iron was fastened around her, so she could hardly breathe. But worst of all was that she could not tell Su Shen what the matter was for fear he might hate her for being a snake that should be crawling in the dust. Seeing her distress, Su Shen thought, "She must be bewitched. I must get her some orange wine quickly and break the spell." As he hurried off, Green Eyes, now also sick and giddy, stumbled to her own room and fell upon the bed, leaving White Modest Beauty alone. Soon Su Shen returned with the magic wine and tipped a tiny bowl of it against his wife's lips. Not knowing what she did, she swallowed a few drops. The wine burned her throat, and suddenly she realized that there was now no way to escape from turning back into a snake. Thinking quickly, she went to her bed, closed her eyes, and gasped weakly, "Please save me now. The wine has made my eyes heavy." Unwillingly, Su Shen left her room. He went outside and walked unhappily through the gay and noisy streets, worrying about White Modest Beauty's strange illness. Back in the room, a horrible change was coming over the beautiful maiden. Her face became thin, narrow, and white. Her ivory-smooth skin grew hard, while scales came creeping and crawling over her, and her lovely arms and legs shrank and grew together. Around her, ever clearer, she saw the green grass, and overhead the great brown trees, and her head ached till it seemed it would split. And thus in a few heartbeats she had become a great white snake curled up on the bed. Su Shen had hardly been gone 10 minutes when he came hurrying anxiously home to his wife. He was so worried that he burst into her bedroom without knocking. Then seeing the drawn bed curtains, he stopped. Slowly he turned to go, to let her sleep, but just then there came a rustling noise from the bed. "I must see if she is better," he murmured, and drew the bed curtains. The huge white snake rose up from the sheets. Su Shen let out a single dreadful cry. His heart gave one bound and stopped. He fell to the floor, dead as the tiles on which he lay. This is that motif of the lover realizing that it's with a supernatural being in disguise, like in Cupid and Psyche, when Psyche is not supposed to see Cupid, and she breaks the rule and sees it, and then she's exiled. That kind of motif. Terrified by Su Shen's cry, Green Eyes dragged herself to the room. Though she was still feeling sick, there she saw a terrible sight. Su Shen lying motionless upon the floor, and a great white serpent coiled around his body as if it had killed him. It was poor White Modest Beauty trying to stroke his head, but she had no hands to do it with, nor any voice to speak her sorrow. Quickly Green Eyes began reciting magic charms, and soon White Modest Beauty was a woman again. Now her eyes streamed with tears. "I have killed him," she cried. "Hush," said Green Eyes, though weeping herself. "Dry your eyes, for he is dead and all is over. We should never have defied the gods. All is lost. All is lost." But White Modest Beauty lifted her head angrily. "No," she cried, "never, never." She rose to her feet, her eyes flashing blue fire. "I shall go to the Grand Master himself," she said. Green Eyes gasped, for the Grand Master was the greatest, the most feared wizard in all the world. He lived alone in the frozen deserts of the South Pole, in a warm green garden he had made for himself among the plains of ice. So now we have to go all the way down to Antarctica, where he has on the subtle energetic plane, not the physical plane, the subtle energetic plane, he has a little Garden of Eden there in the middle of all the ice. Straight and high flew White Modest Beauty, and fast and true, until at last among the clouds she knelt before the Grand Master. Before she could speak, the wizard held out his hand, in which appeared a spray of herbs from the empty frozen air. "Take this," he said, "and you will have your husband again." He had known all the while what she came for, and had granted her request even before she came. Back went White Modest Beauty, fast as a falling star, back over the red lands and the black, the thirsty lands and the floods, holding the herbs tightly, and thus she arrived home in less time than it takes to say it. "Oh, tell me," said Green Eyes. "Was he terrifying? Did he try to eat you? Was he 12 feet tall? Oh, tell me, little sister." White Modest Beauty laughed happily. "He was kind, so kind, and he gave me these herbs to bring Sushen back to me. Quick, let's prepare them." But Green Eyes held up her hand. "Wait," she cried. "When he's alive again, won't he hate you for being a snake?" But White Modest Beauty had planned everything. Quickly she went into the garden, untied her silken waistband, and threw it into the air, chanting, "A white and silken cloth are ye, but white and dreadful ye shall be, and bring my husband back to me." There was a flash of white fire, and the silk became a great white snake, writhing on the grass. In an instant she had cut the snake into 10 pieces. "Now," she said to herself, "I must tell my loved husband a lie, so that both of us may be happy." As everyone who's been in long-term relationships knows, you have to tell all kinds of white lies to keep it going. Then she took the herbs, boiled them into a tea, and held a bowl of it to Sushen's ash-white lips. With the first drop, he sighed as if dreaming. With the second, his heart began to beat. 1 a minute, then 2, then fast and strong, and with the third, he opened his eyes. But when he saw White Modest Beauty, he shrank away from her, shaking with terror. "It's the snake woman," he shrieked. "It's the witch serpent. Go away! Go away!" And he pressed himself against the wall. Tears sprang into White Modest Beauty's eyes, and she wept. For is there anything more terrible than to receive hate from one you love? But little Green Eyes flew to her defense. "What do you mean?" she cried. "Snake woman. The snake you saw now lies outside, killed by the brave wife whom you revile." Then Green Eyes took Sushen by the hand and led him out to where the monster lay, huge and bleeding. So notice that the green snake is always in the helping role. She's what Joseph Campbell would call magical aid, but beyond Joseph Campbell's very limited ascription of myths to mere literary metaphors, this is actual, real green ray energy at the level of the heart chakra. It's real. It's actual. Then Green Eyes took Sushen by the hand and led him out to where the monster lay, huge and bleeding. Sushen stared and clapped a hand to his forehead. "How foolish I have been," he cried, "and how cruel to my sweet wife." And he hurried back and knelt before White Modest Beauty. "Please forgive your stupid husband," he begged. "Surely I must have been mad to think this of you, but now I am myself again and love you more than ever. Forgive me." So they have to kiss and make up. At once a smile broke through her tears, and White Modest Beauty put her ivory-smooth hands against her husband's cheeks. "Surely, my love, it is nothing," she said, and all was well again between them. So he has caught a glimpse of her reptilian nature, that is to say, in Jungian terms, her shadow side. And then in a relationship, you have to deal with the lover's shadow side and then integrate it and accept it. Otherwise, the relationship disintegrates. That's a mere Jungian psychological reading. I prefer the anthroposophical spiritual readings where they take spirituality seriously and they don't just try to crush it down to a mere projection of the collective unconscious with a bunch of stupid cookie-molded archetypes. For weeks after that, they worked happily together in their shop, but then one evening their door was darkened by a heavy shadow. It was an old monk who stood there. Now this is a Buddhist monk, and he, in this story, is in the role of the dragon slayer. And she, of course, is basically a modified dragon. It was an old monk who stood there. He wore a yellow hat, and a necklace of brass beads around his neck shone dully in the dim light, and he held his hands clasped all the time as if they were tied together. When Sushen opened the door, the monk mumbled only these words: "You must come to the temple of the Golden Mountain at Chikang. Tell no person. These are my master's orders." Then he turned and was gone. Sushen knew that he must obey, for this temple of the Golden Mountain was ruled by the great abbot Fathoy, called Mighty as the Sea. It stood close by the ancient and famous pagoda of Thunder and Wind, which is still standing today for all to see. People said that Abbot Fathoy knew everything in the world. For weeks he would sit unspeaking while his spirit traveled the land, listening to trees when they murmured to the winds, to grasses when they whispered together, to streams when they chuckled, to great stones when they groaned against each other. He could walk through fire and not be burned, and poison and knives were powerless against him. All men feared and bowed their heads to Abbot Fathoy, so how could Sushen refuse his summons? So he's a Buddhist monk who has the power of astral body travel through the astral plane, through the Earth's astral plane, which, by the way, is real. It's not a Jungian metaphor either. Next day, Sushen was sent forth without telling anyone his true purpose. Though he hated to deceive his wife, he dared not disobey the abbot's orders, so he told White Modest Beauty that he was going to gather herbs. The old abbot met Sushen on the temple steps. "My son," he said, in a voice that boomed like a rusty iron bell, "your wife is a witch. You can never return to her." Sushen bent his head in grief, for he knew that the old man never lied. But he replied at last, "My love for her is such that I care not what she has been, so what must I do?" "You must be strong, you must stay here until the day you die." And again Sushin bent his head, and thus did he become a monk. But still he saw his loved one's face, even in his deepest prayers. Meanwhile, back at home, White Modest Beauty had waited for her husband's return until long after sunset, and until the next day had dawned. Then she cried to her friend, "Oh, little sister, I am so frightened, for a darkness inside me tells me that he is gone forever. What has happened? Where can he be?" So Green Eyes took to the clouds and rode them back and forth, farther and yet wider, searching. Finally, far below, she saw the Golden Mountain, and there was Sushin, dressed in his gray woolen monk's robes. Swift as light, she returned and told White Modest Beauty. So she, too, because she's a magical being, has the power of astral traveling. She is able to travel through the Earth's astral plane to find him. White Modest Beauty and Green Eyes rose into the clouds like hawks, and sooner than the great blue moon moth beats its wings 10 times, they were knocking at the temple gate. The gate was opened by none other than the abbot himself, to whom White Modest Beauty bowed deeply. "O great one," she said, "I come to take my husband to his home." The old man stood as still as a tree. "Your husband wishes to stay here," he said. "He does not wish to return to a snake enchantress." Again White Modest Beauty bowed, deeper than before. "But I love him, O great one," she said. "Can I help what I was?" The wall behind the abbot was not stiller than he. "A serpent you were," he said, "and a serpent's heart is still in you. He shall not return." Yet a third time did White Modest Beauty bow before him. "O mighty one," she said, "I live for him alone, and also, O all-wise, he will become a father to my child before 4 months have passed. Can you take a father from a child that has not yet breathed?" At this the old man shook with rage like a wind-blown leaf. "It is better," he shouted, "for a child to have no father than for a man to have a serpent for a wife." But now Green Eye's voice was heard. "How dare you do this?" she cried. "You cruel old man, what do you know of a woman's love? You that sit alone, what do you know of sadness that is halved, and joy that is doubled by entering into 2 hearts instead of 1? You who are always lonely, what do you know of happiness? You're no wise man, not you. You're just an ignorant old baby that can't be trusted with anything but sitting on a cushion and pretending to be clever." You have to realize how much of Christianity was created by celibate men who did not understand sexuality and so condemned it. As Augustine said, woman is a temple built above a sewer. And that is the attitude of sin and shame about sex and our body that we have inherited ever since. So these monks, Green Eyes has a point here about this sexually frustrated monk. Rather than seeing other people happy together, he would rather feel hatred toward them. At these words, the abbot, who could walk through fire without flinching and suffer torture without a sound, lost all control of himself. "Thou snake witches," he roared, "go before I turn all to dust and scatter you down the hill. Go! From the holes in the mountains you came, now to them return and trouble me no more. Go, go, go!" Sobbing, they fled back down the hill. White Modest Beauty and Green Eyes wandered without hope. Now indeed it seemed that all was lost. The countryside bloomed, but they saw only a mist of tears. The birds sang, but they heard only the abbot's cruel words. The scent of flowers hung sweet in the air, but the taste of despair was in their mouths. At last they came to the banks of the Chinkang River and stood gazing down into the cool, shadowy waters. Then Green Eyes said, "Little sister, do you remember the great fish of the Yangtze River?" "Yes, indeed," replied White Modest Beauty, "but he is far away." "But he loved you," replied Green Eyes with a sigh, "and it is said that one can hear a loved one calling even from 1,000 miles. So, not daring to hope, White Modest Beauty put her hands to her mouth. "Oh, elder brother," she cried, "come if you love me truly." For a moment there were only the echoes of her voice. Then afar off down the river a wave was seen, moving like a galloping horse. Larger, larger, larger it grew, until it was right over them, and in the center rode the great black fish, the lord of the waters. "Little sister," the black fish panted, "you called and I came." When they had finished telling the fish their story, his brow was dark as a rain cloud. "Not for nothing do I have 1,000 years of wisdom," he cried. "Fat Hoy will curse the day he made you weep." But far away old Fat Hoy was listening, even from his mountaintop. And at that same moment he swept off his long cloak and whirled it around his head, chanting, "O cloak of pain, cloak of power, guard me in this fateful hour, and never let the waters green around my temple halls be seen." Then the cloak grew and grew until it became a great tent that covered all the top of the Golden Mountain. Far, far below the black fish wizard, the lord of the waters flashed down the river to the sea and cried, "Now gather, gather, O green deeps, To help a maiden fair who weeps, to the abbot's temple go, and far above his roof tiles flow. So now we have a meaning of the powers. This would be typically a battle between shamans, which you find all over the place in myth and literature. The shaman of the below, the watery abyss, and the shaman or priest of the heavenly celestial powers, and they meet in a clash. The seas moved as if a huge spoon had stirred them round. Then they went rushing like an army up the river, flooding all the land. And with the seas came crabs and sea serpents and hundreds of kinds of fish, so that sharks swam over houses and dolphins played in and out of windows. At last the water swept to the very foot of the Golden Mountain, and then the Lord of the Waters blew, and a great wind beat the waves into a line of white horses that went charging up the mountain. The temple of the Golden Mountain bobbed like a cork as the pounding waters beat against the mountain, and it seemed that soon it must surely be covered altogether. But then suddenly, with a roar like the end of the world, the whole mountaintop tore loose and floated like a ship, safe and dry under the magic cloak. So his temple becomes like an ark floating on this great flood. The flood myth plays a very important role in Chinese mythology, just as it does in India and in the Middle East. Old Fathoy had won against the very sea itself. Back flowed the waters now, back and back, for the black fish wizard knew at last that he could never conquer the old man of the Golden Mountain. In a way, this is like Gene Gebser would put it as sort of, this is the triumph of the mythical consciousness structure over the magical. What a terrible sight was seen when the sea had returned to its deep home. Drowned people lay beside sea monsters, drowned farm animals beside starfishes and seahorses and strange shining fish, and all the land was desolate. Back went the Lord of the Waters to the bluest and deepest of all seas, weeping in despair. And away flew White Modest Beauty and Green Eyes, weeping for Sushen and for all the poor people who had died in the flood. They flew as far away as they could from Abbot Fathoy. In the temple a day passed, and then the abbot summoned Sushen. "My son," he said, "you can stay here no longer, for now the people hate you because of those who died for your sake. You must go at once to the monastery of the Peaceful Soul in Hangzhou. May the gods be with you and guard you close." So, heavy at heart, Sushen set out for Hangzhou, and after a long journey came back at last. Just as he was crossing the broken bridge over the West Lake, he saw a lady standing in his way. It was none other than White Modest Beauty. Swiftly he turned to go the other way, but there stood Green Eyes behind him, cutting off his retreat. So he turned back and faced White Modest Beauty again. "Why do you wish to escape, my husband?" she asked in a soft voice. "I love you. Why should I wish you harm?" But he drew back from her. "You are a snake witch," he muttered, "and you bewitched me." She turned her face so that he should not see the tears in her eyes. "Oh, why should I harm you, foolish one?" she whispered. "I, who would rather die than see you hurt. Why do you listen to an old abbot and not to me, your wife?" Sushen looked amazed and did not answer her. Then he heard a whisper from Green Eyes. "O hard-hearted one," she said, "here is something you do not know. Soon your wife will make you a father. Does not even that touch your cruel heart?" Something broke in Sushen's breast at these words, and he turned to White Modest Beauty. "I have come to my senses," he said. "Let us go on together, whatever may befall, for do we not love one another?" Now, laughing and singing, the three went into Hangzhou, where Sushen took them to the home of his second elder sister and her husband, whose name was Mr. Li. And so the green snake woman has also, once again, selflessly helped her companion out, the white snake. Sushen and White Modest Beauty were happier than ever, for at last they kept no secrets from each other. She told him how she had been the tiny white snake he had bought so long ago. "How wonderful," he cried, "that I loved you even then." Then one day Sushen became the father of a son, sturdy and good-looking like him, but with eyes that, like his mother's, flashed sapphire blue. They named their son Tsulom, which means as full of learning as a forest is with trees. Many people came to the naming day of Tsulom, and it was a happy house that day. But then suddenly the door creaked slowly open, and there before the door stood the old abbot. The abbot bowed deeply to Sushen and spoke in his voice like a rusty iron bell. "My son," he said slyly, "have no fear, all is forgiven. But your aged teacher feels tired and thirsty. I pray you, fetch me a little water from your spring, then I will go." And he held out a yellow earthen bowl in his thin, blue-veined hands. Happy that Fathoy had forgiven him for his disobedience, Sushen took the bowl and was about to go and fill it with water. But just then White Modest Beauty came to the door to see who the visitor was. At the sight of the yellow bowl in Sushen's hands, White Modest Beauty cried out in terror, "Take it away! Take it away, away, away!" But it was too late. The bowl came alive in Su Shen's hands, humming like a swarm of bees, and lifted straight toward the beautiful head of White Modest Beauty. Then White Modest Beauty wept, as she had never wept before, because she knew her end was near. Closer came the bowl, and still closer. "Goodbye, my husband," she sobbed, "for soon I will be your wife no more, nor any more your son's mother. Remember me." Then the bowl closed round her bowed black head and tightened its grip, and they heard her cry out in pain. And now her clothes fell from her thread by thread, color by color, and scales began to cover her beautiful pale skin. So she's lost her human form. In other words, her physical body has died, but now the soul that inhabited that body is going back to the astral plane. Then her tears flowing like rain down her cheeks, she spoke her last words. "Do not forget me, Su Shen. Oh, do not forget me." And now, with a flash of summer lightning, but with no sound, Fat Hoy was in the house, tall and terrible. He opened his eyes until they were like burning wells and turned them upon the poor white snake. While the guests looked on in terror, the snake shrank and shrank, smaller and smaller, until at last it was no bigger than the little snake Su Shen had bought so long ago. Then the abbot opened his left hand, and the bowl sprang into it, with the little white snake curled up inside the bowl. "Why have you done this?" cried Su Shen, at last finding his voice. "The gods have commanded," said Fat Hoy, "that no changeling shall marry a man. I only obey the gods." "They are cruel and terrible gods," cried Su Shen. "The gods of China have always been cruel and terrible," replied Fat Hoy, "and so will it always be. But one promise I make you. When next you kneel down with your son, you will see her and never rise again." With these strange words, the old abbot turned and strode from the house, up to the ancient pagoda of Thunder and Wind. He bowed low before the pagoda and began to murmur a magic spell. Instantly, with a rending sound, a pit as deep as 100 wells opened in the earth. With a toss of his hands, Fat Hoy threw the bowl down, and down into the pit. White Modest Beauty was no more. Hardly able to see for grief, Su Shen stumbled to his room. There he lay for many hours, neither speaking nor moving. He was wakened at last from his reverie by the sound of a baby's crying in the empty house. It was his son, Tsulum, wailing for loneliness. Su Shen went to his son and touched his hand against the tiny paddled cheek. "Little Tsulum," he said tenderly, "we must say goodbye now, for after what has happened I would be a sad father to you, and that is not good for a boy." So he left the baby with his second eldest sister and her husband, Mr. Li, and went to the Temple of Peaceful Correction. Here he shaved his head, and, bowing before the god Buddha, became a monk once more. The years passed slowly, like white clouds across a blue sky, and Tsulum grew into a fine young boy. But sometimes when he played with his friends in the little grassy places that children choose, they would gather round and make fun of him, singing, "Tsulum's got a monk father, and Tsulum's got no mother. Tsulum's got a monk father, and Tsulum's got no mother." He hated this and would always run home crying. His aunt would try to comfort him, saying, "But of course you have a father and a mother too, and one day they'll come back, and then you'll be ashamed of crying, won't you?" Then Tsulum would nod and wipe away his tears and study very hard so that when he saw his parents again, they might be proud of him. Tsulum did so well in his studies that Mr. Li often said to his wife, "If our nephew continues like this, he'll become a great scholar and be made a magistrate and bring honor to our house." Mr. Li's prophecy was fulfilled, for Tsulum did so well that he was finally granted the greatest honor of all, the chance of competing in the imperial examinations in Peking for the post of a high magistracy. The magnificent capital city frightened him, and he was so shy that he spoke to none of the other young men. But when the examinations came, he forgot all his fears, and his brush pen flew over the paper as if it had wings, never stopping, never pausing. And when all the young scholars gathered to hear the names of the winners read out, the emperor held up the scroll and proclaimed, "There is one who stood far above all others, and his name is Tsulum." Thus, suddenly, Tsulum had become a very important person. He was made a high magistrate, and everybody always bowed low and addressed him as "Your Lordship." Even the emperor spoke to him with politeness, for in China, scholars are greatly respected. But Tsulum never forgot the kind uncle and aunt who had raised him, nor the parents he had never known. And so one day he asked the emperor if he might return to Hangzhou for a while, telling him all his troubles. The emperor gladly agreed, pleased that Tsulum had not forgotten those who had helped him when he was poor, and sent a large retinue of soldiers to guard him on his long journey. So kind of like the Joseph narrative in the Old Testament, Tsulum has the gift of writing, and he moves from a situation, a rustic, agrarian situation in small towns, and then finally migrates to the big cosmopolis, Peking, which is, of course, Beijing, would have been the giant cosmopolis. And now, like Joseph with his brothers, he ends up being reunited with his family. Reaching Hangzhou, Tsulum went straight to the house of his uncle and aunt, where he bowed low before them and humbly paid his respects. Then he asked if he might be told where his father was living, since he was now old enough and wise enough to know these things. His uncle Li told him without hesitation, and Tsulum rose and went straight to the Temple of Peaceful Correction. Within the hour, he had opened the door to his father's lonely little room in the temple and fallen on his knees. "My father," said Tsulum, "your unworthy son kneels before you." Sushen's face was very pale now, and deeply lined, but more handsome than ever. When they had finished talking together, the sun was casting shadows longer than its rays, but at last Tsulum knew all the story that you have read here. Indeed, it is because of his sons and their sons, and all the fathers and sons who followed them down through the years, that you hear this story now. They never let it die. "Tomorrow," said his father, "we will go and burn incense before your mother's grave at the pagoda of Thunder and Wind." So next morning, Tsulum went to the pagoda, where he had built a ceremonial altar, and with him were his father, his aunt, and uncle, and his retinue of soldiers. They lit incense and knelt and prayed, and as the chanting filled the air, it seemed that White Modest Beauty was indeed listening from her grave so far below them. Suddenly Tsulum rose to his feet, raised his arms, and cried aloud, "O spirit of my mother, may you rest in peace, for I, your son, will always do you honor and burn incense before your grave." Then the watchers saw a strange thing. High above in the sky, among the swirling yellow clouds of incense, appeared the old Abbot Fathoy, sitting cross-legged and holding his horsetail badge of power in his hand. Then there was a stranger thing still. Inside the pagoda now could be seen a light, moving upwards, while a sound of singing or crying came from the huge deeps below their feet. Up and up went the light, and then Sushen cried out, for from the topmost window of the pagoda there came a little yellow earthen bowl, and above the bowl there swayed a tiny head. It was the head of a little white snake, a snake with shining sapphire-blue eyes. Then the yellow clouds closed around, and the watchers saw through only dimly as the snake changed back to the beautiful woman, whom Sushen had known as his wife. Her scales became pale and lovely limbs like old ivory, and clothes formed on them like the mists of the morning, gold and scarlet, green and black, blue and silver, while the singing grew louder and ghostly hands combed up and smoothed her glossy black hair. Then with a rush, the mists rolled away, and White Modest Beauty stood before them, enthroned on the clouds and even more beautiful than she had been before. She looked about her wonderingly, still a little drowsy from her long sleep, but when her eyes fell upon Sushen, she smiled, and her lips moved. "My husband, my dearest one," she said. Sushen stretched out his hand and touched Tsulum on the shoulder. "This is our son," he called. "Has he not done us honor?" She smiled and nodded, and her lips moved again. "My little son," she said, "so tall and so grand. It has been a long, long time." But now the clouds gathered again, thick and swift, and it seemed she was gone from them. Sushen fell again to his knees and cried out as if his heart would break. "When shall we meet again? When shall it be?" From deep inside the pagoda of Thunder and Wind came the voice of White Modest Beauty. "Soon," the voice whispered, "soon, soon." And it was true, even as Fathoy had prophesied that day so long ago, for when at last the company rose to their feet, Sushen alone did not move. His spirit had gone to join the one he loved in the lands where all are happy. So they went back to the other world. The couple is reunited again in the other world. And Fathoy was there too, not in an antagonistic role, notice, because when the dead transferred to the other side, no matter how aggressive they were in physical incarnation or awful they were, they're tuned to a higher vibratory frequency. It's sixth density, and all those things are gone, those negative, low vibrational emotions. All right, so we'll stop right there, and I hope you enjoyed the story. My Patreon is, the ID for it is johndavidebert@gmail.com. That's also for astrology readings and for PayPal donations. Thank you.